afternoon, everybody. I'm Natasha Duarte, the director of the Composting Association of Vermont and the lead on this on-farm community scale food scrap and agricultural organic waste management project, which we just familiarly call on-farm composting project. And I'm just going to give a tiny bit of introduction to today, and then we're going to get right into it. So today we are talking about the food scrap composting piece as it relates to solid waste regulations. And it's really intended today. We're assuming that you all have some familiarity with the regulations. We're going to be covering it, but this is really going to be more of an informal roundtable Q&A session, not a presentation getting into the nitty-gritty. And we will be providing some links and other resources that you can use if you do need, if you're in the position where you're really not as familiar as you might want to be in, and you need to pull on some of those threads. We're joined today by Michael Nork and Paige Wilson from the New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services and Ben Gauthier from Vermont Department of Environmental Conservation. And just before I pass it off to them, I just want to ground this a little bit in this overall project that we're doing funded by USDA Rural Development, which is really focused around developing sustainable, community-oriented composting sites with farmer partners to manage food scraps, farm residues, manures, and other organics. And so we're working with 4 farmers in Vermont and 4 in New Hampshire. But one of the goals of these Compost Tea Talks is really to extend the conversation to a wider community. And so it's fabulous to see other folks joining us as well. As I said, this is a USDA funded project, and it is the information that we're developing and the resources we're developing are freely available to everyone. So if anyone has any access issues, I'm the person to reach out to. And here is our project contact information. Mine and Pat Buxton and Athena Lee Bradley, my co-trainers and material developers for this project. And so I am now going to just stop sharing my screen. We're a small enough group, so if folks want to share their videos, you're more than welcome to. And today we're going to be covering some things like where the solid waste management regulations may bump up against some of the agricultural management regulations. As farmers, you all sort of straddle those two things, especially when we get into food scrap management, composting management on farm. I know we have a number of collection and hauling questions. We'll be doing a little bit of sort of comparing and contrasting between Vermont and New Hampshire regulations. So as we answer one question, Ben might explain how it is in Vermont, and then we'll be looking to hear from Mike and Paige about how it is in New Hampshire. And we also have some farms who border Vermont and New Hampshire and may be participating in farmers markets, for example, in New Hampshire, but interested in bringing food scraps into Vermont. So we're really interested in also getting into some conversation about like how, the border is porous. How do we navigate the regulations when we might be crossing borders? So before we get into all of that good stuff, I'm going to ask Ben and Mike to each just briefly explain high level some of the basic regulations for on-farm composting, focusing really on the exemption volumes and what counts towards those volumes, acceptable materials, and anything else either of you want to flag that that might spur questions or things that you get questions often about. And so Ben, why don't we start with you for Vermont, and then we'll move to Mike.
Sure. Hey everybody, and thank you to Natasha, Kat, and Athena for putting this on. I always love conversations like this because as a regulator, I often don't have the opportunity to interface a lot with the farmers that are doing the community composting projects. But they're so critical to the resiliency of the composting system, especially in the rural areas. So I definitely value this. So thank you for pulling this together. And Mike and Paige, good to see you both again. So quick rundown of solid waste composting regs in Vermont. I imagine you may not need to deal with me all that much, which is probably good news for you. We have basically 3 categories, large, medium, and small. And the small threshold is probably the one I'll just talk about now because you won't be mediums or larges, but smalls are 5,000 total cubic yards of composting feedstocks a year, not to exceed 2,000 cubic yards of food residuals. So as you can imagine, that's quite a bit. It's probably much larger than you anticipate being, at least at this point in time, getting started. So that's really where we pick up. So if you compost if you import over 40 or 42 cubic yards of food residuals a year for composting, that's where the solid waste regs would pick up. Now, recently, there's been a legislative change that has sort of made two paths. If you're a solid waste composter, you follow the solid waste path. But if you're a farm, which I envision all of you probably are, then there's a farm path option as well. And I'll try to summarize that pretty succinctly. It's not too complicated, but there are some nuances to it currently. So if you're a farm, you're allowed to compost up to 2,000 cubic yards of food residuals a year, provided you use more than half of that, principally use it on your property, or you're a small farm that includes poultry. So those are the two caveats. And the strange thing about it was, because it was legislatively mandated, there are no rules for it yet. So it's in effect, you're exempt from solid waste rules, but it's the Agency of Ag is still in development of those rules. So it's kind of this weird middle ground gray area right now where they're developing their rules. And in the meantime, you're supposed to follow the solid waste rules. But anyway, so if you do qualify for that, if you're a farm and you're importing up to 2,000 cubic yards of food residuals and food processing residuals, which I think I forgot the first time around, then you would qualify for permitting under the Agency of Agriculture. So that's huge, because that changed the definition of farming in Vermont to include a composting component, which is massive, and I think it's a big and a really good change. I don't know yet if the Agency of Ag is going to have a minimum volume threshold. So the statute says up to 2,000 cubic yards, but it doesn't say where it starts or like where it picks up. So it's yet to be seen if they're going to have a minimum or an exemption. So if you're under, like we use 42 cubic yards a year, I don't know if they'll have something like that. I think they would be wise to do something, and I'll probably comment that way on their rules when they come out. But those are just questions to be answered in the future. Did I miss anything, Natasha or Kat or Athena, that you wanted me to cover?
I think that sounds good. And for our Vermonters in the room, we did put a link to that cheat sheet, Ben,
Awesome.
that sort of goes between exempt, small, medium, and large. And there have been, just for farmers, Vermonters in the Zoom room, there have been farmers that have decided we really want to expand, and they've gone ahead with a medium permit because they're really looking to be large at some point. They may not be filling out that volume now, but they set themselves up to. And so that is something that we've talked to some of our farmers about, in terms of definitely start small, get good experience, understand the recipe and what's happening. But if your 3 to 5 to 10-year plans are to really expand, let's integrate that into siting conditions and things like that.
Good advice.
Great. Mike, do you want to give us a snapshot? New rules in New Hampshire. It's exciting times.
Sure. Thanks, Natasha, Kat, and Athena. Appreciate the opportunity to interface. Like Ben said, us regulators, we don't always get the opportunity to, have these conversations. So really appreciate the opportunity. And yeah, pretty exciting news. New Hampshire revised its regulations effective back in March. Some big changes. Most notably, there used to be a prohibition on composting of meat and dairy under a permit by notification. That has been lifted. That prohibition no longer exists. And just to give kind of a general, like 20,000 foot view, our permitting structure is essentially 3-tiered. We have permit exempt facilities. We have facilities that qualify for a permit by notification, which is essentially the streamlined kind of, hey, I'm doing this thing, I'm just notifying the department, and you get a permit for that. And then the third tier would be a standard permit. And that is it's intended more for like industrial scale, like really large composting operations, or composting operations that don't really fit the mold. They're doing something unusual, or out of the box. So a standard permit is really customizable, but it does require more intensive, it's more intensive permitting process with pretty close review by the department. So that can take a while. Permit by notification probably takes anywhere from 30 to 60 days to be issued. If somebody submits an application for a permit by notification and it's not complete, then unfortunately, usually we just have to deny it, but that doesn't mean you can't reapply. It's really, because it's a notification process, we just require that all the information be submitted and essentially you get your permit. And then you're subject to audit and making sure that you're actually following the rules down the line. With permit exempt facilities, and I think that's probably where most folks in this forum are kind of looking for, right now in terms of starting up operations. We have a permit exemption right now that allows community composting. So that's essentially any facility that receives food scraps or other solid waste for composting where the waste was generated somewhere else. It wasn't generated on site. We also have permit exemptions for generator composting facilities, like if a school or a university is composting material that they generate on site, that's also permit exempt. But the new thing that we have now, which we didn't have before, is a permit exemption for facilities that are basically bringing food scraps from off-site. And the limitations for that exemption are 5 cubic yards per month of what we call solid waste. And for the general purposes, solid waste is food scraps. There might be other types of solid waste that you can compost, but I think just to generalize a little bit, I would say food scraps is really what that's kind of targeting. The 5 cubic yards would not apply to leaf and yard waste because in New Hampshire that falls outside the definition of solid waste. It does not apply to manures, including animal bedding. So like if you've got a horse farm or something like that, great input, it's a great bulking agent. It's a great carbon source, but that also does not apply to that 5 cubic yards. So it's really just food waste. Any wood chips, sawdust, other carbon sources, like waste paper that's been shredded or cardboard, that also does not apply. Wood ash would not apply, and I'm not sure if I'm missing anything else. Again, it's really like manures, leaf and yard waste, and bulking materials don't apply to that 5 cubic yard limit. The other limit that applies to this permit exemption is the composting facility needs to fit within about 600 square feet. So that really only applies to the active composting area, as well as any like feedstock mixing areas. It wouldn't apply to storage of finished compost. So that's kind of the general gist of it. I'm happy to, have more in-depth conversations and address any other specific questions that folks have.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's great. And I tell you, we sort of launched the idea for this project before the new rules, and I'd been in touch with Mike about just, making sure that New Hampshire DES knew that we were doing this and these were our plans, but the timing could not have been better because it just made a much clearer path. And as both Ben and Mike sort of alluded to, the, conversations around regulations, it's always a shifting landscape, right? There's, like Ben said, there's this new Act 41, which changes things about, on-farm composting. There's these new rules in New Hampshire. And so it's great to get a sense of where you're operating now, but we're always trying to remind folks that, keep an eye on these things because they do change. Yeah, Mike, go ahead.
There's 2 things I just thought of that I should probably clarify. The 5 cubic yards is within a month. Right. So that would equate to about 60 cubic yards per year. And one other thing that I wanted to clarify is in New Hampshire, we don't really have, the Department of Ag doesn't really have a direct role in regulating composting of food waste or solid waste. That's really within the realm of DES. But Department of Ag does have some BMPs for composting on farm, but in general, they tend to defer to us when it involves like material coming from off farm, for example. So there isn't a distinction so much in New Hampshire as far as like agricultural composting versus other types of composting.
And that's for food scrap composting, not you guys don't like the manures are exempt anyway.
Correct.
That's great. And just so folks know, our hope is if people's schedules line up is to have next month's Compost Tea Talk with some ag folks from both states on talking about some of the nuanced regulations, but also that'll be an opportunity for I know some folks on the line are certified organic, and so we'll get into some of those, questions in that next one. But that's a really important distinction, Mike. Thanks for making it, because one of the questions we have received is like where, and I don't know that we really want to address it directly right now, but just so we all keep it in the back of our minds, is it's always like where do the solid waste and ag regulations bump up against each other, and where is it really clear and where is it like it does when we're talking about water quality. It just seemed like the Vermont required agricultural practices around water quality concerns was one, more familiar because I'm in Vermont, but also I think more stringent. And so those were the guidelines we've been using with our farms in both states in terms of siting distance from water and all of that. But as we go through our questions, just feel free, I guess, both, every Paige, Mike, and Ben to be like, that's actually not our house, because we're all still figuring out whose jurisdiction is what and where things get mixed up. Okay. Let's see. I'm just looking through chat. It looks like a bunch of folks have been introducing themselves and sharing some resources and helping us visualize what 42 cubic yards of food scrap look like, etc. And then we did have a question from Dan in New Hampshire. Was it 600 square feet composting area in New Hampshire? Does that just include windrow pile area or also space between piles? Like if he's like getting his tractor in between windrows, and I'll just tag onto that, and or curing, like if it's finished and it's just setting somewhere to cure. So can you clarify that 600 square foot area?
Yeah, sure. So it really applies to the footprint, like the aggregate footprint of areas used for collecting food scraps, so incoming waste, areas used for mixing feedstocks with food waste or whatever is being composted, and then the active composting area. So it'd be the aggregate area of all of those. They don't necessarily need to all fit within a contiguous 600 square feet. But for example, for the active composting area, that pad would include the spaces between the windrows.
And what about cure piles? Does that include that as well, or can that be separate? The finished compost.
So the finished compost wouldn't
be part of that
in that, but I don't think you could say that curing piles are necessarily finished compost.
True, not quite.
So
Dan, I hope that helps clarify.
Actually, sorry, my video doesn't work, so you
no worries.
Me, but so just to clarify, let's see, what was I going to ask? Oh, does that include the area of other materials like yard waste or manure, or is that separate?
So that's a good question. Really, again, try to focus on what we're regulating, which is the solid waste portion. If it is manure, that's exempt. It's not something that, as long as it's not like, once you start commingling the food waste with other things, that's really when you'd start to count it, so to speak. But if you've got a separate pile of, feedstocks that are stored somewhere on site, we wouldn't count that as part of that 600 square feet. So if you've got like manures or yard waste that are kind of segregated and are just kind of like, you know, in storage, so to speak, and until they're ready to be used, that wouldn't count towards the 600 square feet. Does that help?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Okay.
Perfect. That's a really good clarification. I have some questions that people submitted when they registered, not all of whom are here, but does anyone else here have questions they want to jump in? Or I can ask a question and then we can always bounce back to the chat. So seeing, unless someone flags me down, you can also, if you're in the room, just, you know, unmute yourself or raise your hand or something. I think we're a small enough group that we can definitely just talk amongst ourselves. Only because it just came up and I think was a really good distinction to make. So a lot of the collection areas aren't necessarily exactly where the composting, the active composting is happening, in part because, you know, we don't necessarily want to invite public into our active composting area, but also because, you know, collection might happen during a CSA, community supported agriculture pickup or drop off, you know, that, you know, they're bringing food scraps and leaving with their veggies kind of thing. And that's not necessarily going to happen in an active composting pad area. But we do get a lot of questions, and I'll try to summarize them, and maybe we can just go back and forth between sort of New Hampshire, Vermont differences around, and I'll just ask them maybe sort of collect them up, but in similar buckets. Like, is it okay to, I guess the ultimate question is, can food scraps be dropped off at an unstaffed place? Like, can a farm stand have a bin that people can bring food scraps to, or is it really only during, you know, like when there's a CSA pickup and there's farm people there, they can bring their scraps, but can people just drop their scraps off at any time? And somewhat related to that is, can farms have a bin at the end of their drive or at a pull off or at a place that makes sense for them, and invite their neighbors or community folks to leave scraps there, as long as they're checking them? And it's, you know, we understand, I think collectively in this group, that there are nuisance concerns. We're not going to be leaving stinking bins of food scraps unattended for a long time, but what are the rules around that? Ben, do you want to start for Vermont, and then we'll shift to Mike or Paige?
Absolutely, sure. So we typically consider that style of food scrap drop off to be part and parcel with the composting activity. So if you're a farm composter that's exempt, then that's part of your process. It's an exempt food scrap drop off. You just got to incorporate it in your compost piles. If you're a food scrap composter that has to have a permit with the Agency of Ag, then that falls under the Agency of Ag jurisdiction. And then if you are a food scrap composter that does have a permit from us, then we would just factor that into your certification. So it seems pretty straightforward in that regard. The one scenario where it might be a little more nuanced here in Vermont is if it's transferred. So in those first three scenarios, the food scraps are all delivered to the parcel, the property doing the composting. If you have a different parcel or somewhere down the street that you want people to drop off their food scraps, and then you're going to transfer that to your property, that would actually require a food scrap drop off registration from us, which we just dusted those off brand new in 2020. We've started to get, I think we got 5 or 6 of them now. I don't know. They're starting to roll in. So far, they seem like they've been a success for people in rural areas. But that's the only time that it would need a registration from us, is if it's not going into a compost property, if it's going to be transferred from one parcel to the compost site. Hopefully that's succinct enough.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. And we're going to put a pin in that transfer piece, because I have specific questions about that, but I want to let Mike or Paige chime in about the drop off on a farm property question for New Hampshire. Or if you want to take it from there and then launch into the transfer, we can get into more of that too.
Yeah, I guess I can just clarify. I think it's similar in New Hampshire. If the drop-off location is associated with a property where the food waste is actually being processed and composted on that same property, that would be counted towards that total aggregate area. That collection area would be counted towards the total aggregate area of the exempt facility. If it's a permitted facility, that would be, counted towards whatever. There aren't necessarily square footage restrictions with a permitted facility, so it doesn't really matter. If it's food waste that's being dropped off by the general public at a food co-op or a farmer's market, and then being transferred to another location where the composting is happening, that would be permit exempt under our rules, as long as no more than, I think it's 1 cubic yard at any one time. Yeah, 1 cubic yard. So about 4 48-gallon toters, 200 gallons, roughly 200 gallons at any one time, can't be stored more than 7 days. And it just needs somebody to be kind of checking in on things once a day, basically, like during their normal, like if it's open 24/7, basically just check on it once a day to make sure there aren't any nuisance conditions. I realize in most cases, the food waste is probably going to be transported much more frequently than once a week or 7 days. But that's at least just to provide some sort of, maximum limit on time frames. Yeah.
Sure. And so just to clarify, or to put a finer point on it, what I'm hearing both of you say is that a person does not have to be there necessarily at the time of drop off. So if there's just a bin at a farm stand on a farm and it's not staffed, it is allowable for community members to drop off in that location, as long with the caveat that it's being, someone is checking in on it.
Yeah, I think that's correct.
Ben, that's correct for us.
Yeah,
too.
for the solid waste stuff, I can't speak for the Agency of Agriculture, what
For the
they'll
solid
do for
waste
their
stuff.
rules, but for solid waste, yeah,
Okay.
we would, yeah, that's fair.
We've just had these, I've had a number of nuanced conversations about staffed, unstaffed, and so I just wanted to be crystal clear for myself. We do have some farmers who are considering doing collection at farmers markets and bringing it back to their farm. We just heard from Mike about the volume exemption for that sort of, I think of it as micro hauling or micro transfer. Ben, am I correct that there's still an exemption based on small volume in Vermont for hauling too?
There is, but I don't think it plays into this scenario. So
Okay.
in the farmers market, or sort of the backhauling scenario where we have CSA members and you're delivering stuff at the farmers market or something, and they're bringing their food scraps back to you and you're taking them back to the farm. In that scenario, if there's no compensation changing hands for management of the food scraps, then it wouldn't need a hauler license from us. That would be an exempt from a hauler's license requirement.
Regardless of volume?
Regardless of volume, if there's no compensation trading hands, then it's exempt.
Then it's not hauling as a business. That's really great. I don't know that I was aware of that specific nuance.
Yeah.
That brings up a thought for me in terms of New Hampshire. I had completely neglected that there is a hauler registration requirement, but the same kind of caveat applies where if there's no compensation, or if the person doing the hauling is not, quote, in the business of hauling, then they technically aren't required to haul or aren't required to register, but they'd be welcome to do so. There's no cost to it. It's just nice for us to get some data on who's out there doing that. So if we get questions and somebody's like, who's hauling food scraps, who can I call up in my area to help with this? We have some resources that we can share. And we also get data reported to us annually from haulers. So it helps us to know how much food scraps are being diverted.
Yeah, for sure. And so I think what I'm hearing is good news is, because we do have some farms, like I said, on that border, and it just, in some cases, a farmer's market, a very close and accessible farmer's market is actually across state borders. It doesn't sound from the individual state regulation point of view that there are any issues with that. Do either of you know of any, like, I'm bringing food scraps across the border issues?
issues.
I mean, like, would that be thought of as differently? I mean, like, so there's not like New Hampshire has one set of regulations and Vermont has another in terms of transferring food scraps, say from a farmer market to a farm. I'm just which is good, because if there were different regulations, then that might get trickier. But I'm just wondering if there's any flags that are raised for either of you of transporting food scraps across the border, like a state border.
No, in general, I think solid waste is kind of a regional thing, and it kind of flows throughout the region. So there's typically not an issue with it. The one thing I would say on this topic for food residuals in particular here in Vermont, we do have statutes that require food scraps that are generated in Vermont to be source separated, and for non-compostable materials to be removed from the food scraps, regardless of where they go. So in that scenario, I don't know if that's more or less stringent than New Hampshire's requirements. But that has to happen in Vermont before they go across the border, or before they go anywhere, really. But that would include to a New Hampshire facility.
Yeah. And I think sorry, go ahead, Mike.
I was just going to add, I don't think there's any specific requirements in New Hampshire relative to in-state versus out-of-state. Okay. Our permit exempt facilities, it doesn't specify anything about where the food scraps come from, so they could be from anywhere, really.
Great.
And with permitted facilities, typically the permit would specify a service area. But most of the time, I think folks who want to do composting want an unlimited service area so that they can kind of draw from the surrounding communities. And that could include Vermont. And I don't think that there would be any concern. There's certainly concern about disposal in New Hampshire, coming from, waste coming from out of state and being disposed in New Hampshire's landfills. But for things like this, I think there probably would be less concern because it's a higher and better use. It's recovering resources. It's essentially recycling. So
great.
Yeah, and it doesn't make a lot of sense to make a hauler just you can only haul, like if they're in like White River Junction or something, like you can only haul on this side of the river versus the rest on the other side. Like it just doesn't make any sense. So
yeah, there's this waste shed concept of, I just wanted to be clear about it in terms of, questions that we get of, navigating these things. We want to make sure that we're helping our partners think through what they might need to think through. Great. Does anyone, I'm also just checking on chat. I don't see any questions, and I'm happy to continue sort of through my list, but like I said, just feel free to jump in. Let's see. We do have some questions about, we've received some questions about considerations of regulations for potentially selling finished compost. And if there are requirements or best practices for labeling or testing, et cetera. And I realize that this might be, as a soil amendment, this might be straying into the ag realm of things. So if so, you can just pass on that. But why don't we take that in terms of selling finished product? A number of farmers who are, either just starting in this project, and also other farmers that I work with in other contexts are certainly ramping up their production of compost, hoping that it will be a value added product that they can sell to diversify some of their revenue. Do either of you want to take that first? One of you can just jump in.
Sure. Yeah.
Ben, go ahead.
Yeah, it's this is a good question, and it's changing, like you said, Natasha, at the beginning. Things change, day to day. Sometimes this is one that is changing in Vermont. For solid waste composters, we have the basic analyses that you have to run basically just once a year. Sometimes we require it more for larger facilities, but it's pretty loose on the requirements. Obviously, exempt facilities don't have to meet any sampling. We definitely suggest that you do. You don't want to be sending off a load of immature compost or compost that's going to be phytotoxic and just kill whatever somebody spreads it on. That'd be bad. So we definitely recommend some baseline monitoring, and I can help folks with that if they have any questions about it. But you hinted at it, I think a little bit, Natasha, that in Vermont there's a new fertilizer / soil amendments registration program. Maybe it's not super new, but it now applies to all composts that are, I forget the caveat. This is an ag rule, so I'm not 100% up on it, but all composts that are used to generate agricultural products, I believe is how it's written. So basically, if you're putting it on land to grow something that's an agricultural product, then it needs to be registered and they require some sampling to be done of it. I think that program is kind of in its infancy right now, and they're going to be rolling out the sampling requirements over time. So they're not requiring a ton of sampling now, mostly the registration fee and product listing. But there will be more sampling requirements to come as part of that program, I suspect. I think that covers sampling in Vermont, I hope.
Yeah. Mike?
So in New Hampshire, this does kind of straddle the line between DES and Department of Ag. Currently, Department of Ag doesn't really have regulations governing, distribution, sale, or land application of composts. So it falls into a gray area a little bit because DES, our purview is really regulating solid waste facilities. We're not necessarily regulating the distribution of the products that they make. So if it's a composting facility, the compost, essentially once it's finished compost, it's no longer regulated as a solid waste. It's now a product. For permitted facilities, there are requirements for basic quality parameters and also maturity. That doesn't apply to permit exempt facilities, but it probably could be used as a general guideline. Like Ben said, I think it's probably a good idea for anyone who's going to be just generally distributing compost rather than using it on their own site. You probably want to, make sure that you're distributing something that is actually going to work and is a truly finished compost. So yeah, it's not something that we directly have a role, like we don't have labeling requirements. We used to have in our rules, we used to have quite extensive and kind of onerous requirements around that, but we kind of scaled that back because it wasn't really within our authority. So that may change over the years. Department of Ag right now, I don't know if it's really on their radar, but it may change.
Great. And so we'll definitely revisit this when we have our ag folks on. But what I'm hearing, at least initially, is that if you're exempt and you're making just a small amount of compost, you could sell it. And well, that's just like a normal sale of things. So that's great. And we'll circle back to that from the ag point of view. I knew we were kind of straddling into gray area there, but it's a good thing to just get your voices in on. Let's see. In terms of water quality concerns, is that I know, the required agricultural practices in Vermont go in detail about water quality concerns and siting and manure management and distance from water and all of that. Can both of you talk a little bit about how or if water quality, I know this is out of solid waste, but it's still, within sort of, I think, DES and DEC purview, or correct me if I'm wrong, but how does that, do you interface at all with that when it comes to food scrap composting, leachate collection, regulations, rules, etc.?
Yeah, I think we specifically designed our exemptions to kind of be at a level where we wouldn't be super concerned about the volumes. So it's kind of intentionally designed that way, but that doesn't mean you can't do harm with that amount of material. So I think anytime you're importing a food scrap and it's becoming like a critical environmental harm or hazard or a public health risk, I think the solid waste program could always step in and say, you need to cease this operation if it's becoming an environmental risk. I don't think that's a very likely scenario, but if it's done really poorly, maybe it could be. Mm-hmm. But outside of that, no, we trust that exempt facilities are going to, not going to be represented to do harm. And if you're composting correctly, you shouldn't, to be honest. if you're under the ag track, they're going to have the RAPs, their composting rules that'll address water quality concerns, and obviously we have our own if you're a solid waste facility. So yeah, hopefully not an issue for at the smaller level.
Yeah, I was going to say just don't impact water quality and you're good.
Simple.
Yeah. So similar to what Ben said, when we envisioned the permit exemption, we tried to design it so that it wouldn't be at a scale that would be of concern. The idea is that this is what we think a facility can do without the need for a permit. You know, if they operate within those parameters. One of the general conditions for the permit exemption is not to discharge pollutants to surface or groundwater. So there are some basic checks in terms of making sure the facility is just being a good neighbor, not causing nuisances, and not, having an environmental impact that affects, water quality or just general environmental factors. If it's a permitted facility, there are specific siting requirements and setbacks to certain water features. But for a permit exempt, there aren't specific setbacks. I think we referenced best management practices provided by the Institute for Local Self-Reliance. I don't recall if that document has any guidelines about water, distances to water. But the other thing is that, again, there isn't quite, with Department of Ag, there isn't like they have a specific program or a set of rules for composting on farms. But they do provide some BMPs that also could be used as a guidepost. They have, it's called the Manual of Best Management Practices for Agriculture in New Hampshire or something like that. It's published by the New Hampshire Department of Ag. And they do provide some guidelines. Their focus is really for on-farm composting.
That makes sense. And something you said, Mike, once, this is a little bit of an aside from the water quality question, but I know in Vermont, I work with a number of small exempt composters who are aware of the 42 cubic yard of food scrap per year regulation, and they just are composting. But there are a couple things that you said, Mike, that makes me want to ask the question, do people need to apply for an exemption in the state of New Hampshire, or if they're under the volumes, are they just good until they are over the volumes or the space?
Correct. It's the latter.
Okay.
They don't need to actively seek authorization to operate under a permit exemption or register or anything like that. It's really just kind of it's an allowance for that activity to happen without having to interface with us directly. If they were to exceed those limits, or there was, God forbid, a complaint from a neighbor or something like that, we might have to, intervene or kind of do a little investigation. But generally speaking, yeah, they can just kind of go ahead and do what they want to do, as long as it meets those general conditions for the exemption. If they want to start out under an exemption and then progress to a larger facility, that could totally happen. Somebody wants to start a composting operation under the permit exemption, and then say like 2 or 3 years later, they're like, you know what, I'm growing and I want to grow even more. Maybe it's time to pursue a permit. So the next step would be a permit by notification, which really isn't, it's not a huge hurdle to climb. Yeah, it does require reporting on an annual basis. It does require that the person managing the facility has some basic training, which could be certification through New Hampshire's solid waste operator training program, or through some alternative training focused specifically on compost facility operations. And it allows up to 10 tons per day of solid waste. So that would be, again, 10 tons of food scraps primarily. So it's actually
it's a big jump.
It's a big jump, yeah. And then anything more than 10 tons per day would require a standard permit. It's kind of that next level.
Yeah, and that is one of the questions was, what happens when you surpass that limit, and who do you go to? And it sounds like in New Hampshire, they would go to you. They would go to DES if they're exceeding the exempt volume. In Vermont, I think ultimately up to a point, they'll be going to the Agency of Ag, but those rules are in process. And then after that, it would be DEC.
Yeah, we'd like for things to be a little cleaner than this usually, but this is kind of a murky one. So it depends too, Natasha. If you're selling more than half of your compost that you generate, you might need a solid waste permit off the bat, even if you are a farm. So there are other pathways, even within that farm, not exemption, but the ag route that may apply. So yeah, if you're a farm and you're using most of it on your property, then you could go up to 2,000 cubic yards of food residuals a year and be under the Agency of Ag. If you're selling more than half of that, or you want to exceed 2,000 cubic yards, then you would come to solid waste. And at that point, at that level, like I mentioned before, the small, medium, and larges, that would require a permit application or a registration application for us.
Yep. And just to clarify, because Mike did a good job clarifying what is included and excluded from that volume. Ben, if a farm was getting a big load of leaves in the fall, does that count towards that 2,000 cubic yards or towards the total cubic yardage of a solid waste permit? Or is that a different bucket?
Yeah, we factor it all in to the composting volumes. So if you're what we call our small registrants, that's 5,000 total cubic yards and 2,000 up to 2,000 of food residuals. Leaf, manures, anything that you're bringing in for a composting feedstock would count towards that 5,000. Even if it may not be a solid waste in and of itself, we're counting it as a feedstock in that calculation. The one area where it doesn't apply is for our exemption. I don't know if this makes sense, but we've changed that in our 2020 rules because it was a bit of a sticking point with the farms. We changed it to imported. So you can generate a bunch of that stuff on your own property, all the vegetative farm waste, all the manures, all that stuff, and compost that. But it's not until you import either 100 total cubic yards or 42 cubic yards of food residuals for composting that you would trigger a permit from us. Hopefully that came through clearly. It's kind of a hard thing to explain. But.
If I understand you correctly, then if you were to do a small, medium, or large solid waste permit, that cubic yardage is not just imported, it's total managed.
Yeah, everything composted gets calculated.
So even on-farm materials count towards that.
Yep, at that level, it seems appropriate to factor in all the feedstocks that are going into the system.
Yep. And that's great. I mean, just as a tiny bit of background, the Composting Association of Vermont was part of and really advocated for that rule change because we had farmers that if they were already composting their own manure, et cetera, and they were at that 100+ cubic yards, if they took one bucket of food scraps and added to it, they would need a permit, which wasn't the intent. And this is also where we learn together in terms of here are regulations and they seem to make sense. Let's apply them. Do they still make sense? Is it still actually meeting the intent of the regulation? And so this is why I think these roundtables are really valuable. So I keep checking the chat. I have a couple more questions and we have about 10 minutes left, but if anyone on the call wants to raise their hand, unmute and just jump in or put something in chat, please do. One of the questions that, well, there's two other questions here that I wanted to get to. Let's see. Well, we'll take this sort of one that is a little bit on the same track that we've been talking about right now. In terms of, and this is asking you folks to stretch your regulatory hats a little bit. So the question is, what local regulatory concerns need to be addressed by prospective composters, or who should every food scrap collector contact in their town or county to make sure that all regulations are being considered? And so I'll just get us going by saying, we in our training talk a lot about nuisance issues and nuisance ordinances, local zoning. That varies as everybody here knows. I think town by town by town seems to have their own zoning twist. but also like health commissioners potentially, or other entities that may have some oversight over food scrap composting or some interest in. Might be good to let them know. They're not necessarily going to tell you you can't do it, but you might want them to know what you're doing. Yeah, Mike or Ben or anybody else, do you want to jump in and sort of let's think about who else might be on that list, if anyone?
Yeah, I can speak certainly for here in Vermont. I always strongly recommend, if you're thinking about doing a compost facility, to reach out to your solid waste management entity. It's always good to have that network. I mean, those people who are doing the waste collection and the waste management and transferring things on a daily basis, they know where you might be able to get wood chips. They know where you might be able to find certain feedstocks that you're looking for. And they can put you into contact with the people that are generating that stuff. And so in those situations, everybody wins. Also, as part of, if you're applying for a permit for a solid waste permit or a registration, you would need to contact the town anyways. You need to send the town a copy of your application. So that sort of happens through our process, but I always recommend reaching out and just sort of greasing the skids and saying, what do I need from you? Because sometimes, like Natasha, you said before, local zoning permits may need to be applied for, especially if you're a farm. You may not have some of that stuff in place that you might need for a composting operation. The only, trying to think if there's anything else for a suggestion. Oh, that was the other thing I wanted to say. If you're talking about other DEC permits that you need from Vermont for an activity, DEC just launched this pretty cool permit navigator tool that you can put in, you punch in the rudimentary stuff of what your activity is going to be. And then it kind of tells you, hey, you may need X, Y, and Z permits, and here are the contacts for those permits. So that might be a helpful tool for you. And it kind of is more nuanced to your situation. It'll ask you a bunch of questions. And then, if you're near a shoreline, you might need something for wetlands or shoreline protection stuff. So there's a bunch of different things that are built into that tool that I think are pretty helpful. It launched relatively recently, so I think they're still in the shakedown phase, but it's hopefully will be a pretty powerful thing for people that are applying. But those are my suggestions.
That's fabulous. And I'll get the link for that tool from you, Ben, and share it out with this group.
Ben, you're muted.
I'll do it right now in the chat if you want.
Oh, fabulous. Yes, please.
I don't have much more to add to that. I think starting with the local, whatever the local authority is, if it's the town or the health officer or, checking with the zoning board, that is probably, that can vary widely from town to town. So you really do want to check with local authorities. Some resources might be available through local regional planning commissions. In New Hampshire, we don't really have a strong solid waste district structure. It's really kind of just town by town. There are a few districts, but so the local landscape is really, I think, before you even if you're seeking a permit, for example, I would say start with the local town first, just to see what requirements might be in place. So you kind of have a clearer picture at the outset of what steps you might need to go through, because the permitting process through DES is fairly well defined in our rules, but local processes might not be as clear or as transparent. So yeah, it's a little bit outside of I'm not sure of all the parts and pieces because it's going to vary so much, but
sure.
Yeah.
I think also not that this is really not that these groups might have like any say in like permitting things, but if your town has an agricultural commission or like a waste reduction committee or solid waste committee or anything, just for knowledge and resources and any kind of connection that way could also be helpful.
Fabulous. So let's see, we have 4 minutes left. There's a Vermont specific question that I'm going to hold, and I'll follow up, Ben, with you about current use. And I know that's in the Department of Taxes, but there's been some actually compost specific questioning that has come up around that. But I think I'm going to hold that one. And just more broadly, maybe a closing, just because this project is about collaboration and building community and crossing. Oh, I'm sorry, Athena, I didn't see your hand up. Do you want to?
Oh, just quickly, I had a question about if there is an issue with our farmers' compost operation, like an odor complaint or something like that, what would be the process as to helping them out or any kind of enforcement, or how would you handle that?
That's a great question.
That is a really good question. A couple things I think that apply to that here in Vermont. So we have a contract with Compost Technical Services, James McSweeney, and we have up to 20, maybe even more on case-by-case scenario hours available for troubleshooting, for technical assistance to composters. And we prioritize that for composters that accept from multiple generators. So if there's a farm that's just having trouble with their piles and they're getting odors or nuisance complaints, and that seems to be the issue, they can contact me, and I can see if it's a scenario where we can have James go out and do some troubleshooting and try to get things back on track. I always try to start there first and just see if we can't figure it out, because usually there's a pretty simple fix or a pretty obvious cause to those things. If it becomes kind of a reoccurring thing and the neighbor relations thing really goes south, then there could be a situation where solid waste would come in and say, or if they're with Agency of Ag would have jurisdiction clearly. But if it's an exempt facility, like I said before, solid waste could say, this isn't working out. You either need to solve the odor and whatever the nuisance condition is, or you need to cease the activity. That would be the real repercussions we would have. And we have an enforcement and compliance section that would deal with that. That's outside of my jurisdiction, but that's kind of how it could work in Vermont. But we typically try to help people succeed first.
Yeah, I think that's pretty common with a lot of environmental agencies that I've worked with. I know New Hampshire is very similar, that we try to do what we can to educate, to avoid problems beforehand. That's part of the reason why we have a solid waste operator training program, so that solid waste operators are certified. Unfortunately, we don't currently have a lot of resources for technical assistance and direct, on-site assistance with composters. So it'd be great if we had a contract with James McSweeney as well, but we don't currently have that. This is part of the reason why the exemption has a reference to the best management practices by ILSR, to provide some general guidance for the activity. If there was an issue and a complaint, and it was because maybe the person doing the activity wasn't aware of what the requirements were, we would reach out to them and try to educate them on what the requirements are so that they stay within those boundaries. If it's a technical issue, we'd try to work with them on that. It's a very similar situation of what Ben described. I mean, if it really comes down to like necessary enforcement action, that's not where we try to start. That's the last resort.
Good. Thanks.
And that's, I'll just say that's part of, I was really pleased when we started this grant application, even before we got the grant, that I'll just share with everybody on the call that DEC and DES were both very supportive of this, in part because we're providing and extending technical support to farmers who are wanting to integrate food scraps into on-farm composting systems. So hopefully those who are part of this project are getting some of that technical support, and then for others, there are, we're also hoping that, down the road, these farms, once they really get going, will also be cohorts and peers, and can, maybe be a place to visit and talk to other farmers who are doing it successfully. And so, yeah, and I will say we're at the hour, and I want to be respectful of everybody's time. So I'll just connect on the last couple questions and get back or post on, sort of more broadly to this group, the answers that we get. But thank you all so much for joining us today. Special thanks, of course, to Mike and Ben and Paige for joining us. They're putting their contact information. That's great, because I was going to put the contact slide back up. But of course, if anybody loses that or needs that, you can reach out to me directly, and I can connect you with the right folks.
And most importantly, thanks to everybody doing the composting. This is awesome stuff that you're doing. I hope you understand that it is appreciated and needed in a lot of these areas. So thank you.
Yeah. Great. All right. And with that, we'll wrap. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Natasha.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.